You know that. That has probably been brought to you many times, so I jump there a little bit. Interesting are the different market figures for us, because it gives us and also the people who work in cloud computing a certain relevance. You can either see the overall economics, so we could save 645 billion over the next 5 years, says the Center for Economics. But there are other figures. They are more or less all around very soon 100 billion market share per year. And yes, it's quite impressive. So take Gartner, they say 500 billion till 2015 of replacement of existing software products. They basically say we have done too long this cycle of projects and projects and projects and have not maintained the infrastructure which is behind it, and therefore there will be really very big redistribution processes. Now, the difficulty, back to my production engineering background, if you have something that can save so much money, supposedly or real, then in an industrial and economic environment, there is a moment where all dams break. That is actually what I think. There are a lot of people also in our advisory committees who say, yeah, but this problem is not solved, and this problem is not solved, and this problem is not solved. But if they invite the chief executive to Nice, and they work on him 2 days with a good marketing thing, this is a real-world example when I was in industry, that was my boss, and then he comes back and says, what you told me there about process computing in our machine tool company is all very fine, but I buy IBM. And that was it. He lost his company 3 years later, and we all left, but the decision was so much based on economic figures which he believed, and we could not counterbalance, that the decision was made. And I think that is quite, I mean, that's history and really almost very old history, but that is what I guess will happen in many of these areas. And when you see that, for instance, the American government puts 20% cuts on the budgets of the infrastructure of their agencies, they say we have costs of around 100 billion a year. Next year you will have to deal with 80 billion, and this is the so-called cloud-first strategy. Now, if you do that, you could do that to the European Commission, you can do that in any company. It puts people under an enormous pressure to find solutions to keep their infrastructure running, and the only way out is further centralization for them. It could create also positively 2.4 million jobs, while the jobs that would be lost are only in the areas of around 100 to 150,000. So the replacement there in industry is quite interesting, and I take this all with some skepticism, but it shows you the dimensions, and the discussions which go on give it quite a high stake on the political agenda. Now, speaking to you today here, these are probably the arguments you like to hear the most, but we built them into the political documents. So it is interoperability, lock-in risks, portability of data that is clearly identified by many of the industrial players, especially the users. Then this whole area of privacy and legal, governance and control, and security and dependability. Now, what can I do with a strategy? I can write a political document that in the end is a blueprint for the other policies which are affected by this, to bring in this argument of cloud computing into the political debate. More I cannot do, but that is already quite a lot. Now, you probably have followed a bit this discussion on net neutrality over the last 18 months. I was then in the telecom area more, 2 years. it was quite interesting to me. I was thinking, what kind of debate is this? Net neutrality, selling over the top, the arguments of Google, the arguments of the telecom providers. The outcome you can summarize very simple. You can say, yes, we are very positive to net neutrality. Under the condition, then what happens in the network is transparent. Now, the whole communication of the Commission on that topic is about that. How transparency and manageability of the network is there when you overall subscribe to the principle of net neutrality. Very similar it is here. Interoperability and especially privacy and legal is very dependent on some very specific directives or regulations which come out of Brussels. One of them is, of course, the Data Protection Directive. And I just chose the example of net neutrality to show you what can happen if you fix the technology or nearly the technology approach in a directive. Now, a directive is a kind of hyper law. It is implemented by many member states. So it is not really the law, but it is the abstract form of a law. Now, there is from 1994 a law in a directive in data protection, and the outcome of it is that it became more difficult with every member state putting it into national law. While the promise at the beginning was we align those laws, and by that we make it easier for interoperability between the states. Now, with what solution we will come in 6 or 8 months is, for me, very difficult to predict. But that somebody sits at the table to my colleagues and says, look, your distinction between data controller and data processor is no longer adapted to cloud computing, because in cloud computing, in the end, what was previously the data processor, who has basically no liability in that law, can become the data controller. And that throws out that technical concept which was put in 1994. Who wants to blame our colleagues then? That's a long time ago, in the overall setup. Now, to make that independent of the technical implementation is not a simple exercise. And that's why such a word like neutrality is so appealing. There is the governance and control issue, the licensing terms. I've already touched about it, that we still need a nomenclature for that, and the use of legacy applications, and the security and dependability issues. And they all touch directly on directives or regulations in the European Union. Here you see them. So there are some policy areas like data protection, governance, privacy, security, and consumer law, standardization, interoperability, and portability, which is a specific policy which we are just overhauling and bringing in those fora, so-called fora and consortia, which you probably contribute to, as legitimate standardization bodies which can be used in public procurement. That is a policy line. What are the member states doing? What are they doing in their deployment of cloud computing? And there are certainly some coordination issues. It would be really nice if in some areas we could do that together. You know that there are many policies, and I've been in that field, where we have still full intergovernmentalism, what we call intergovernmentalism, nice word. Now, we are a supranational body. My favorite number is 729. And that is because that is 27 square. If you have 27 member states and you want to regulate something in intergovernmentalism, it means 27 square. It means 729 contracts. Now, there are policies like this in the European Union. For instance, if you work in different member states and pay your social security contribution in these member states and have paid your pension rights, I mean, bilaterally out there, I can tell you what will happen if you have worked in 2 or 3 or 4 member states during your lifetime and you become 60 and you think, now, what will be my pension? It's an exponential curve which starts at 5 years per member state to make the balance. And you can imagine how complex the contracts are. So anecdotal, the old ladies would come to Brussels to my colleague and bring him confiture, marmalade, on a trip to Brussels if he had finally, after 15 years, hit over the head of that member state to give them a paper saying this and this is your pension. Now, to do something like that in the extreme, and the more member states we become, 28 square is an even bigger figure and faster growing figure, as we all know from mathematics. This is where the standardization and interoperability issue mainly comes in, and the coordination issue between member states. There are areas where we really have to have, whatever solution, a body. I'm not advocating necessarily everywhere that it should be supranational like the European Commission, but to go on making this kind of bilateral agreements is extremely damaging to the field. And there are a few where we work very heavily on, you probably know that, on e-identity in cross-border commercial enterprises or endeavors. If you buy something cross-border, you obviously need an e-identity which goes cross-border, and we don't have that at the moment. There's industrial policy, and there is this very important topic of international policy, because we cannot build that in Europe alone. We have to do that in agreement with all parts of the world, and we are in direct discussion with many parts of the world. So there is the agreements we have, or the discussions we have, firstly with the United States, with Japan, and with China at this moment. So can we become more crowd-friendly, more than crowd-friendly, but also cloud-active? That is the term our commissioner has used. So in data protection, data may be hosted anywhere. There is a specific legislative issue here, and the implementation of data protection is very different, while it should have been very similar and harmonized. We were, and we are still probably the leader in data protection, so it's not really an alternative to lower the data protection standards in Europe. We could also see this as a positive step. We could say that our high standards make it attractive to host clouds in Europe, and we see that already. It's very attractive for non-Europeans or non-Swiss to put their money in Swiss banks. The analogy works also for data, probably. If the protection of your data in Europe is very high, then it could lead to a situation where many people consciously put that on European servers. So it can, what looks from the outset as a disadvantage and a barrier could well be turned into an advantage if we get it right on the industrial structure which is behind it.